The Billionaire's Secret Heir, a love story that breathed. Thomas was a quiet, deeply reserved child from the moment he was born. Even as a baby, he recoiled from strangers' arms and grew uneasy when left alone, even with close family or friends. His relatives assumed he would outgrow his shyness. After all, there had never been a timid soul in the Anderson lineage. Yet as the years passed, Thomas, fondly called Tomi, only withdrew further into himself, growing more introspective and guarded with each stage of life. At the age of 7, everything changed. He was sent to live with his great-grandfather, Alexander Anderson IV, the formidable patriarch of one of the country's most powerful family empires. Thomas was special, not just as the first male grandchild, but as the first male descendant in 4 generations. Alexander IV and his late wife had raised 6 daughters, and each of those daughters had given birth only to girls. For decades, the Anderson family had endured quiet mockery, a dynasty of wealth and influence, yet unable to produce a male heir. They were whispered about as a lineage without true loins, as if cursed to fade through the female line alone. Then came Thomas. His mother, Rita, had been a first-year university student when she became pregnant out of wedlock, a scandal that initially brought shame upon the family. But the moment she gave birth to a son, everything shifted. The disgrace dissolved like mist in sunlight. A boy had been born. The long-rumored curse was broken. Rita was forgiven, embraced, and celebrated. And Tomi, sweet, silent Tomi, became the most cherished child the Andersons had ever known, more treasured than all the legitimate grandchildren who came before or after him. At just 7 years old, in a private ceremony steeped in tradition and solemnity, George was formally named the heir to the Anderson Empire. Like a young king out of ancient scripture, he was anointed, not with oil, but with expectation. His great-grandfather, Alexander IV, a man of iron will and boundless ambition, took personal charge of the boy's upbringing. Thomas was no ordinary child. He never had been. And now the weight of an entire legacy rested quietly on his small, shy shoulders. From the day Tomi arrived at the great house on Victoria Island, his life ceased to be that of a child. The mansion was a fortress of marble in silence, its corridors lined with portraits of stern men who had built the Anderson fortune on oil, shipping, and steel. At 7, Thomas's small feet barely made a sound on the polished floors, yet every servant, guard, and tutor already knew this was the boy who would one day command it all. His great-grandfather, Alexander IV, was 79, tall even now, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He rose every morning at 5 and expected Tomi in the study by 5:30, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, barefoot in silk pajamas. There were no cartoons, no playdates, no excuses. The curriculum was merciless. Mornings belonged to numbers. A retired central bank governor taught him balance sheets before he could properly spell his own surname. By 8, Tomi could read a profit and loss statement faster than most adults and explain why crude oil differentials mattered to the family refinery in Warri. Mid-morning was languages. French with Madame Okonkwo, who rapped his knuckles when he conjugated wrong. Mandarin with Mr. Lee, who made him recite the Analects while standing on one leg if he slurred a tone. Arabic followed, because half the family's new deals were in the Gulf. Afternoons were for the body and the mind in equal measure. He swam a kilometer in the Olympic-sized pool before lunch. No armbands, no complaints. A former Navy SEAL taught him to hold his breath for 3 minutes and to fall correctly if ever pushed from a yacht. Fencing came next, then horsemanship at the polo club in Nikoyi, where other children stared at the silent little boy who rode better than most of their fathers. But the evenings, those belonged to Alexander alone. They would sit in the library that smelled of leather and old money. The old man never raised his voice. He simply asked questions that made Tomi's chest tighten. Who are you when no one is watching? What is power worth if it cannot protect what you love? Why do men follow a leader they do not fear?
Tomi rarely answered out loud. He was still the shy boy who once hid behind his mother's skirt when guests visited. Words stuck in his throat like pebbles. So he listened, and Alexander watched him listen, nodding as if every silence was the right response. At 9, they began their journeys. First to the refinery in the Delta Creeks, where Tomi, dressed in a small hard hat, shook hands with roughnecks twice his height who called him Small Oga. He learned how men spoke when they thought no one important was listening. Then to London, where he sat in oak-paneled boardrooms and watched his great-grandfather dismantle arrogant British bankers with a single raised eyebrow. Tomi sat still, hands folded in his lap, memorizing every pause, every smile that never reached the eyes. At 10, they took him to the village in Anambra his mother came from. Alexander made him walk barefoot through the red dust, while aunties ululated and pressed garden eggs into his small palms, fondly calling him by his native name, Uche. That night, under a harmattan moon, the old man whispered, "Never forget the soil that grew your mother. Empires that forget their roots rot from below. You are an Igbo man. Never forget that." Tomi slept in a small room with a mat and a lantern. He did not complain. He never complained. There were moments, brief, stolen moments when the training paused. Sometimes, very late when the house was asleep, Thomas would slip down to the kitchen. The old cook, Mama Ngozi, kept a tin of chin-chin for him. She never asked why his eyes were red. She simply poured him cold malt and let him sit on the flour-dusted counter, swinging his legs like any other child. Once, when he was 11, he found a stray kitten trembling outside the gate. He smuggled it to his room, hid it in his closet for 3 whole weeks, feeding it shreds of steak from his dinner plate. When Alexander discovered it, he stared at the boy for a long time. "You know pets are not allowed." "Yes, sir." The old man sighed. "Give it a name, then. Responsibility begins with what you choose to protect." The kitten was called Shadow. It slept on Tomi's pillow every night, until the day, years later, it didn't. By 12, Tomi could negotiate a joint venture agreement in 4 languages, outshoot his bodyguard on the range, and quote Sun Tzu, the Bible, and Chinua Achebe in the same breath. He still blushed when strangers looked at him too long. He still sometimes hid in the library when parties grew too loud. But if you watched carefully, you could see it. The way he now entered a room and the air shifted, even when he said nothing at all. The way grown men straightened their ties when he passed. The way his great-grandfather's eyes softened just for a second with something that might have been pride or fear. The shy little boy had not disappeared. He had simply learned to carry an entire empire inside his silence. And the world, whether it knew it yet or not, was already learning to wait for his voice. To the world outside the high gates of Victoria Island and the bulletproof walls of boarding schools abroad, Thomas Uche Anderson was simply that quiet boy with the driver who never speaks. No one ever heard the full name. At the international school in Accra, he registered as Tomi Adewale, his mother's maiden name. At La Rosie in Switzerland, he was Tomi Mensa, another borrowed surname. At Harvard, where he read economics and computer science, he was simply T.O. Anderson. No hyphen, no the fifth, no hint of billions. His great-grandfather had been absolute. The name Anderson opens doors, but it also paints a target on your back. Until you are ready to rule, no one must know who waits behind you. So Tomi learned early to disappear in plain sight. He wore the same 3 hoodies for years. He never posted on X. His account had 9 posts, all landscapes, no face. When people asked what his family did, he said, "My mother lectures at Babcock University, and my grandfather is retired." Both statements were technically true, just missing a few zeros. The drivers who ferried him everywhere were under NDAs thicker than phone books. The bodyguards dressed like postgraduate students and sat 2 rows behind in lectures. His pocket money arrived as anonymous transfers from a trust registered in the Caymans labeled Educational Grant. Even his accent, soft, pan-Atlantic, impossible to place, was part of the armor. Girls especially never suspected. There was a Manka in JSS 3 who thought he was shy because he liked her. He did like her, but he vanished every December to visit family in the village, actually to spend Christmas on a yacht off Capri, learning tax structuring from Swiss lawyers. She cried when he stopped replying to texts. He read every message in a bedroom that cost more per night than her father earned in a year, and never wrote back.
He was 12. It was his first lesson in collateral damage. At 16, in Switzerland, there was Sophie, half French, half Nigerian, daughter of a diplomat. She chased him for months. They kissed once behind the chapel during a snowstorm. She asked where he disappeared to on long weekends. "Family stuff," he mumbled, tasting her lip gloss and the lie at the same time. She posted a blurry photo of their gloved hands on her private story with the caption, "Mon mystère." 3 days later, the account was deleted by someone who was not Sophie. Tomi never explained. At Harvard, there was Chloe, New York, old money that suddenly looked like new pennies next to his. She spent an entire spring trying to figure him out. You're not poor, but you're not showing off either. Private equity kid? Crypto? He laughed quietly and changed the subject. One night, drunk on cheap wine in her dorm, she whispered, "Sometimes I feel like you're a prince in hiding." He almost choked. "You read too many novels," he said, and left before sunrise. Even his closest friends, 3 boys who thought they knew everything about him, only ever visited the family house in Lekki Phase 1, a nice 6-bedroom rented expressly for that purpose. They swam in the pool, ate jollof cooked by a housekeeper, and never suspected the real compound 30 minutes away had its own helipad and a panic room the size of a bank vault. The only time the mask almost slipped was at 21. Her name was Ijeoma. She was doing her master's at LSE. Brilliant, funny, the kind of beauty that made people turn on the street. They met at a poetry night in Shoreditch. For once, Tomi had escaped his security for 3 hours, a carefully negotiated experiment. She teased him for a silence, called him library boy, dragged him to a 24-hour bagel shop on Brick Lane. He let himself talk, really talk, for the first time in years. When she asked him his full name, he heard himself say Tomi Anderson and felt his stomach drop. She Googled it right there on her phone, squinting in the fluorescent light. Nothing useful came up, just a shipping conference in 1998, an old photo of a white-bearded man accepting an award. She shrugged. "You have a common name, babe." He kissed her to hide the relief and the guilt. They dated for 7 months in secret. He flew to London under aliases. She thought his family commitments were sweet. On the night he planned to tell her everything, ring already bought, speech rehearsed in the mirror of a Mayfair hotel, his great-grandfather had a stroke. Tomi disappeared from her life without a word, blocked on every platform, number dead. She never knew the private jet that left Northolt at 3 a.m. was racing to a bedside in Lagos, where a dying king waited to pass the scepter. Years later, when Forbes finally ran the cover, Thomas Alexander Anderson V5, the 29-year-old who inherited West Africa. Some of those girls saw the face they once knew and felt the air leave their bodies. Amaka, now a lawyer, dropped her phone in court. Sophie closed the laptop and cried for reasons she couldn't explain to her husband. Chloe sent a single text to a number that never worked. "You bastard. You beautiful bastard." Ijeoma, married with a daughter, simply stared at the magazine for a long time, then put it away in a drawer she never opened again. Tomi saw none of the messages. By then, he had learned the final lesson his great-grandfather drilled into him on those long evenings in the library. A king may love, but a secret prince must never be loved back. Not truly, not safely, not yet. So he carried their ghosts quietly, the way he had once carried an entire empire inside his childhood silence. By 31, Thomas Anderson was no longer a secret. His face was on the cover of Africa Forbes, The Economist, and every society blog from Lagos to London. The Anderson Group now spanned 3 continents, and the boy who once hid behind borrowed surnames had become the youngest black billionaire on the planet. He wore the crown well, tailored Brioni suits, a voice that could silence a boardroom with 3 quiet words. But the weight of it had carved new lines around his eyes.
He had everything and nothing that felt like home. Then came Adaora. He met her on a rainy Thursday in Enugu. Tomi had flown in unannounced to inspect the new hospital the foundation was building. No press, no entourage, just two security men pretending to read newspapers in the corner. The contractor was late, the generator had packed up, and the sky opened like Judgment Day.
He stood under the leaking zinc awning of a small bookshop, trying to stay dry, when she appeared beside him holding a ridiculous yellow umbrella covered in cartoon pineapples. "You look like someone who forgot rain exists," she said, tilting the umbrella so it covered him too. He opened his mouth, ready with the polite deflection he gave everyone, but nothing came out. She was smiling like rain was a celebration, not an inconvenience. Her braids were wet at the tips, her Ankara skirt splashed with mud, and she had a gap between her front teeth that made her look permanently on the verge of laughter. "I'm Ada," she said. "I sell children's books and terrible coffee. You look like you could use the second one." He followed her inside because he genuinely could not think of a reason not to. The shop was tiny, warm, smelling of old paper and Milo. Children's drawings were taped to every wall. A cattle whistled in the back. She poured him coffee in a chipped enamel mug that said "World's Best Auntie," and went back to stacking picture books like he was just another customer. He should have left. Instead, he sat on a plastic stool meant for 5-year-olds and asked what her favorite book was. She answered without hesitation, "The Little Prince," because he loved a rose that didn't even know how rare she was. Something in Tomi's chest moved, small but unmistakable. He came back the next week, and the next, always alone, always in simple jeans and native shirts his stylist would have burnt. He told her his name was Tomi, just Tomi. He said he worked in his family business. She never asked which family or what business. She talked about her pupils at the government school where she taught primary 3, about her mother's pepper soup recipe, about how she was saving to buy more books in Igbo. She teased him for never finishing his coffee. She called him Mr. Serious and laughed when he blushed. He still blushed at 31. One Saturday, the children begged Auntie Ada to bring her quiet friend to read with them. Tomi found himself on a mat under a mango tree, 20 small bodies pressed against him, reading Topsy and Tim in the funniest voices he could manage. When a little girl fell asleep on his lap, Auntie Ada looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. He kissed her that evening behind the shop, rain dripping off the pineapple umbrella she still insisted on carrying. It was soft, slow, tasting of coffee and groundnuts. He waited for the old panic, the voice that always said, "Run before they find out," but it never came. Months slipped by in that small bookshop rhythm. She met his driver once and assumed the Prado was borrowed. She used his phone to call her mother and never scrolled past the lock screen. When the hospital opening made national news and his face was everywhere, she was marking continuous assessment booklets in a village with no light and missed it completely. He almost told her 100 times. On the night he finally decided, ring burning a hole in his pocket, speech trembling on his tongue, her mother had a stroke, mild but frightening. Ada needed 38,000 naira for tests the government hospital wouldn't do for free. She didn't ask him. She started counting her savings in front of him, biting her lip the way she did when she was trying not to cry. Tomi went to the small Zenith branch down the road, transferred 5 million naira into the hospital's account, paid for the private ward, the best neurologist in Enugu, and the ambulance from the village. Then he walked back to the shop, hands in pockets, and said nothing. 2 days later, her mother was sitting up in bed eating Ada's pepper soup and calling the mysterious benefactor that boy's guardian angel. Ada looked at Tomi across the hospital room, eyes narrowed. "Tomi." "Yes." "Who exactly is your family?" He took a breath that felt like the first one in 31 years. Then he told her everything. The refinery, the planes, the years of borrowed names, the covers of magazines, the bodyguards drinking bad coffee on the corridor right now pretending to be cousins. He waited for the shift, The widening of eyes, the calculation, the slow backing away. Instead, Ada started laughing. Not the polite kind, the deep, helpless belly laughter that ended in tears. When she finally caught her breath, she wiped her eyes and said, "So all this time, I've been serving the richest man in Africa 300 naira coffee and he never complained?" He stared at her. "You're not angry? That I paid for my mother? That I sat on the floor reading to the children while wearing a watch worth more than my village?"
She shook her head, still smiling. "Tomi, I fell in love with the man who let a 6-year-old braid his hair with pink yarn. The rest is just noise." She reached for his hand. "I don't need the empire," she said quietly. "I just need the boy who blushes when I tease him. Can you give me that boy forever?" He slipped the ring on her finger right there in the hospital corridor, between the smell of disinfectant and the sound of her mother humming old hymns in the ward. 6 months later, they married in the small church beside the bookshop. Ada wore a simple lace gown her auntie sewed. Tomi wore white native and smiled more in one afternoon than he had in the previous decade. Only 20 people were invited, which included his immediate family members. The press never found out until grainy photos leaked weeks later, and the entire country lost its mind. But that was later. On their wedding night, in the tiny flat above the bookshop, surrounded by bodyguards because Ada refused to leave until the new term started, she curled against him and whispered, "Tell me something true, Mr. Billionaire." He thought for a long time. "The first time you shared your umbrella," he said, "I wasn't hiding from the rain. I was hiding from the rest of my life, and you made me want to step out of the dark." She kissed the place where his heart beat, steady, finally unafraid. Outside, Enugu slept under a quiet moon. Inside, a king held his queen, and for the first time in 32 years, Thomas Uche Anderson was no longer a secret, not even from himself. If you felt your heart move while watching Tomi and Adaora's love story, if you smiled, cried, or remembered that real love doesn't need a Forbes cover to be priceless, then do these 3 things right now. 1, hit that like button. Let's show YouTube that beautiful love stories still matter. 2, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter because this story is far from over. And 3, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever loved someone who saw the real you before the world ever did? Or are you still waiting for your own pineapple umbrella moment in the rain? Your comments are my fuel. I read every single one. And if this story touched you, share it with that one person who needs to remember that sometimes the quietest souls carry the biggest hearts. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. I love you guys. Stay kind, stay soft, stay in love. Peace.